And folks, just to note, we will be starting in about a minute. And good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this next session in our Spectrum Conference from Outlaws to In-Laws. My name is Joe Storch. I'm an associate counsel in the SUNY Office of General Counsel. I use the pronouns he and him, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to this session. As a reminder, we are using closed captioning for all of our sessions. You can activate closed captioning on your own Zoom controls at the bottom right by clicking to show subtitles. We encourage you to participate in the conversation using the hashtag SUNY Spectrum. You can also join the Facebook Workplace group that we have created. If you do not have a login for that, feel free to reach out to us at spectrum@suny.edu. I want to keep my remarks brief because we have an incredible session today, and I cannot wait for it to start. When we heard that this book was coming out by Bill and by his co-author, Christopher Riano, who many of us know in New York, we were very excited and we said, we absolutely have to talk about this at the SUNY Spectrum Conference. We were supposed to have a live session at the end of Pride Month. Of course, that got delayed due to COVID, but we are so pleased to still be able to bring this to you virtually as we come here in Spectrum. We have had a tremendous 3.5 days of content, and that content will continue this afternoon and into this evening, and we'll close out tomorrow with some great sessions. This session, as I see it, is about words and words matter. And I want to foreshadow that a little bit, not with a story about Bill or about Todd Laursen, who I will introduce in a second, but by about our moderator, Libby Post, because many years ago, she served on the SUNY working group that developed the policies that became state law in New York. And when we were talking about affirmative consent, some of you have heard me tell this story. She said, you know, many of our LGBTQI students don't realize that these protections apply to them. And I was putting the notes into the computer and I said, well, Libby, what should we say? And she said, well, how about the definition of consent does not vary based upon a participant's sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. We typed it in, survived through the edits, survived through the SUNY policy, survived through reviews by Democrats, by Republicans, and it became law in New York. And it is an example, well, it's one sentence among hundreds and hundreds of sentences and dozens of pages of a law, but it's because words matter. There is a big difference between outlaws and in-laws. I am old enough to remember when the most progressive politicians were in favor of civil unions. They said, well, we wouldn't want marriage. We want something that's separate but equal-ish, right? And separate but equal is okay, right? And they wanted civil unions rather than marriage. But words matter. Words matter to the people who are getting married. Words matter to their children, to their family, to their friends. Words matter in society. And it is such a privilege to be able to have this conversation here at the largest university in the United States. SUNY has taken this on as a real challenge to do better and to be better and to lead. And that leadership comes from our faculty and students and staff. And so it is such a privilege to have with us our Chief Academic Officer, our Provost, Dr. Todd Laursen. And you could find his bio online and you'll read about his books and his articles and teaching okay. But what you should also know is his deep commitment to students and academic excellence, to equity, to being able to bring our students into this century and into the decades to come in the strongest, most equal, most forward-thinking way. And so a real privilege to be able to turn it over to our provost, Dr. Todd Laursen. Todd, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Joe. And indeed, the honor is really mine to be with everybody today. As Joe mentioned, my name's Todd Laursen. I use the pronouns he and him, and I am provost of the State University of New York, and I've served in that capacity for about 2 years. It's really a very great pleasure for me to introduce today's speakers. As Joe indicated, Libby Post, who is the president of Communication Services, is going to be moderating this virtual fireside, and I'll be turning it over to her in a moment. But I also am so pleased to get to meet virtually Bill Eskridge, who is a professor at Yale Law School and author of the book Marriage Equality from Outlaws to In-Laws, which we'll be discussing. This has been on my bedside table for about the last week, and I really do want to keep my remarks quite short because we've been promised a little bit of the story behind the story, and I'm very much looking forward to the opportunity to hearing about that. But I'm really struck by two things. I think one that Joe has already mentioned is that words do matter, and I think the stories that are in the book and the tales of how the changes that we have seen have affected people's lives and have really turned on those words, to me was very striking as a non-specialist in this area. And I guess the second thing that I would mention from my point of view too is just, I guess I'm of a generation, I'm in my mid-50s now, and as engineers will sometimes do, we sort of, get into what we're doing and we carry on with it and can sometimes lose sight of how quickly things have changed and how profoundly. And, I think I'm sort of cognizant of the fact with the size of the system we have and some of the challenges we face societally now, and really thinking hard as a system when we look at some of the issues we're dealing with now with racial inequalities, with diversity and equity issues, and how we can be a little bit more intentional in our curriculum, in our programming. These are not easy issues, right? And I think that one of the things we, of course, have all learned is how much work we have yet to do. And that's probably something we shouldn't have needed reteaching, but nevertheless, I think it is an important takeaway. But it also means that, changes need to be substantive. And I think that in this area that we're going to talk about today, it's a very interesting case study to me because those changes have been substantive, and they, I would, of course, defer to the experts. I'm sure we would all agree that there is more progress to be made, but I think it does give hope. It gives hope to the value of persistence and expertise and really caring for each other to produce profound social changes that really affect people for the better. And so I think with that, I would really like to minimize my own remarks and turn things over to Libby and Bill and just express my pleasure at being able to be here today and to hear the discussion on this very important topic. So thanks to you both, and thanks to you, Joe, for the kind introduction.
Well, thanks, Todd. I appreciate once again being asked to be part of this conference. I've been doing this for as long as the conference has been going on. And, as I've said a number of times over the last 2 years, I got my start at SUNY. I was part of the student lobby group back in 1978. And the idea that we would have out SUNY presidents or have these kinds of conversations back in the 70s and 80s was not going to happen. It just didn't. We had to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And so what we see now is the fruits of our labor. I mean, to have a book like this come out, for us to be able to go from being outlaws to then celebrating our in-laws is an incredible accomplishment. I was in the Senate chamber when marriage passed here in New York State. It was an incredible moment. And, you know, but there was a lot that went on before, and there's certainly more that's going to be happening now, because the struggle is nowhere near over. Marriage might be decided, but our rights are constantly under attack. Even with this year's decision on non-discrimination by the Supreme Court, there's still so much more to go. And this book, and in my conversations with Bill, it was like a little walk through my own personal history, because I knew a lot of people he talked about in the book, he's going to be talking about in the PowerPoint. And it was like, here's my life, just right there for everybody to see, because it's the history of our community going back to the early 60s up until now, and how important struggle is, how important political involvement is, and how important it is for each and every individual to stand up and say, I'm an LGBTQI+ person, I count, and I have political power with my vote, with my feet, and with my voice. So with this, I'm going to turn it over to Bill Eskridge, who, as we know, is a law professor at Yale, and he's taught at a number of different institutions and has taught some of the people that, some of them we know and some of them we don't. But nonetheless, Bill, the stage is yours, and I'll get back to you at the end when we start moderating and entertaining some questions.
Thank you very much, Libby. Mine are he, him, and his. And I really appreciate Joe, Todd, and Libby for these wonderful opening remarks. And I appreciate your hosting me as we talk about this book, which I'm going to try to introduce through some PowerPoint. The PowerPoint screen should be revealed. And Joe started off with words matter. When I was young, which was many decades ago, though not quite a century, the words that were used to describe sexual and gender minorities, and these were the nice words, these were the government words, were homosexuals and other sex perverts. People who are now called LGBTQI and others were demonized under words like this in the 1950s and the 1960s by the government. And by doctors and professionals, we were considered mentally ill and indeed psychopathic. So it went without saying, when I was growing up, the concept of same-sex relationships was literally inconceivable. And certainly the government would not have recognized those relationships. So one of the things that our book emphasizes is not just that words matter, which I think is a major theme of the book, but the ways in which lives matter. Our book, unlike any of the others, is not a story of one organization or one collection of heroes. Our book is actually a story of America and American lives. So Black Lives Matter. I believe that personally, but our book documents that Black Lives mattered essentially and throughout to the marriage equality movement. Women's lives mattered, not just gay and bisexual women, but also straight women, transgender women. Their lives mattered. And of course, LGBTQI+ lives mattered in seeking marriage equality. So at the very bottom of my normative experience in the 1960s, there were already rays of hope bursting through in American public law. Mildred Jeter Loving and her husband Richard Loving were the authors of one of them, and that is the Supreme Court case of Loving versus Virginia, a heterosexual different race couple whose marriage was recognized by the Supreme Court, notwithstanding pervasive social prejudice, not just in the southern states. And the civil rights movement, and people like John Lewis, who just died, gave their lives not just for the rights of people of color, but for the rights of other minorities. And throughout the marriage equality debate for 50 years, which we recount in the book, many of our strongest allies were straight persons of color. Equally important was the women's rights movement, which was very inspirational to me. Women asserting their rights and their social equality not only liberated lesbians to have productive lives and productive jobs, but directly inspired some lesbians to seek marriage. One couple that proposed in 1967 was Thea Spire and Edie Windsor, later a major Supreme Court case. The first federal marriage lawsuit was a few years later, Donna Burkett and Menonia Evans, whom we'll encounter later on. And then at the same time we were having the Civil Rights Revolution and women's rights, there was also the sexual revolution, and gay men, lesbians, bisexuals, transgender persons were pushing back against the police and the government even before Stonewall in 1969. So also in 1967, Jack Baker proposed to Mike McConnell. Baker and McConnell were later the first gay marriage celebrities. And here are Menonia and Donna, the first federal marriage lawsuit. All of those lawsuits in the 1970s, very interesting, but they were all unsuccessful. And following them, of course, was the AIDS crisis, which consumed much of America and the LGBTQ community in the 1980s and into the 1990s. Yet, at the depths of our despair, during that period, we also lost Bowers and Hardwick, the sodomy case. Even at the depths of our despair, marriage again was raised as a potential goal for our community. And it was raised most prominently within Lambda Legal, the main LGBTQI rights litigation organization from the 70s onward, between its top two officers, Tom Stoddard, who maintained we need to revive interest in marriage as a goal for our movement, and Paula Edelbrick, who also adamantly supported full equality for sexual and gender minorities. But Edelbrick said, I don't think marriage is the right goal at this time. And so this is another theme that we pursue through the book. The critics from the left as well as the right, and Edelbrick very eloquently raised three objections which reverberate even to this day among progressives and all of us. Is marriage appropriate given its patriarchal and conjugal origins? Edelbrick actually had a positive agenda, and her positive agenda was not just focused on marriage. Her agenda was what I would call families we choose, opening up second parent adoption for lesbian couples, even those who are not married, alternative family forms like domestic partnership, and protections and benefits for cohabiting couples, not just limited to married couples. And then finally, Paula presciently predicted that marriage as a goal for the movement would have the risk of crowding out other agenda items, such as job protections, very important for all of us, sodomy reform and criminalization, and hate crimes, which from her point of view should have been our top priorities. Notwithstanding the Lambda debate, LGBTQI couples voted with their feet, and notwithstanding the gayocracy went into court. I represented one of those couples, the first to file the lawsuit since the 1970s in Washington, D.C. But the pioneer couple were Janora Dansel and Nania Bayer, and two other couples in the Hawaii case filed a little bit later in 1991. And the Hawaii case ultimately produced a ruling by the Hawaii Supreme Court, a multiracial, highly diverse court that said in 1993 that if you exclude same-sex couples from institutions like marriage, that is a sex discrimination subject to heightened scrutiny under the state ERA. Most states have equal rights amendments, Hawaii among them. Judge Chang, depicted in the PowerPoint, had a trial in 1996 and issued an injunction which was stayed on appeal, recognizing marriage equality. In 1998, however, a religion-based coalition persuaded the voters of Hawaii to stave this off, and marriage equality died in the Aloha state. Moreover, and this astounded me in the 1960s, was a huge backlash nationwide, not just skepticism in Hawaii. We were the objects of ridicule and a great deal of antimony, so much so that even people we thought were our allies among liberal Democrats deserted us in droves. And the result was the ill-named Defense of Marriage Act of 1996. The sponsors of that act, Senator Dole in the Senate, Speaker Gingrich in the House, and President Clinton, the nation's 3 highest ranking adulterers proclaimed themselves protectors of marriage against committed lesbian couples raising children, such as one of the Hawaii couples demonized by President Clinton and his allies. Notwithstanding yet another nadir for our struggle for marriage equality, we had a breakthrough in Massachusetts in 2003 and 2004, thanks to the grassroots efforts of feminists and LGBT activists in Massachusetts. The woman in the center is Mary Bonato, who is our lawyer. The little girl cutting the cake is Annie Goodridge. Her 2 mothers are standing to her right, Julie and Hillary Goodridge, celebrating their victory in November of 2003 for the Massachusetts Supreme Court. Now, in 2004, when Massachusetts actually started handing out marriage licenses, the map was still pretty sparse. Massachusetts, the only marriage jurisdiction, and then you had Vermont, California, Hawaii in blue that have alternative institutions, what Libby was referring to, these separate but not quite equal. 4 years later, the marriage map is still pretty sparse. There are more of the shaded states that have some alternative institution, but you still have Massachusetts and soon Connecticut later in 2008, who recognize marriage equality. Yet, here's a punchline. Between 1996 DOMA and 2004, the public opinion numbers were relatively stagnant. We got a big bump up, ironically, from DOMA, and then pretty stable until 2004, when, thanks to GLAAD, many civil rights leaders, many feminist leaders, the ACLU, LGBTQ folks, grassroots, religious leaders, all of that coalition, thanks to them, we get marriage licenses in Massachusetts. And then you notice the blue line, which is support for marriage equality, ticks up about 2% every year, including the years where we're losing most of the lawsuits and not getting marriage equality in most of the states. And correlatively, the red line of opposition ticks down about 2% every year based on Nate Silver's average of polling. So by the time you get to 2011, it's basically tied, and then the numbers go up after that. Based upon this demographic reality, the world is changing in our direction. And we start getting victories, sometimes in unexpected places. Iowa, right in the middle of the country. Lawsuit 2009, McKinley, Dawn, Brianna, and Jen Barbaruskate, 4 plaintiffs, 2 of the children are plaintiffs in this case, prevailed before the Iowa Supreme Court, a unanimous ruling joined by conservatives as well as liberals. New York, you've already heard that. Libby was there. So you've got Alfonso David, you've got Libby, you've got Judith Kaye, the great chief judge who helped pave the way normatively for us in a state high court case. Big moment is the election of Barack Obama in 2008. Remember when we still just have 1 marriage equality jurisdiction and we're just about ready to get Connecticut. Now, as you all know, President Obama campaigned, I'm for civil unions, I'm for equality, I'm not at marriage at this point. And our book tells the story, a whole chapter, on the public evolution of the Obamas, which paralleled the public evolution of America, as you see in our diagram. And it culminates in May of 2012 with Vice President Biden and then President Obama both coming out of the closet, heterosexuals, happily married, in favor of marriage equality. And of course, that's the famous Obama interview. When the president and vice president come out of the closet, the map looks something like this. As you can see, the very dark colors, marriage equality, an expanded map, including most of the Northeast and little chunks elsewhere. 2 of those states that I've blackened in, Maryland and Washington, however, faced referenda in November of 2012. There was a danger this would be temporary. Maine, which is not blackened in, but has a euphemism, domestic partnership, our side put a referendum on the ballot to create marriage equality potentially. November 2012. And Minnesota, the other side had put on the ballot an initiative to add to their constitution. In November of 2012, we won every one of the referenda and initiatives on the ballots in those 4 states. Barack Obama out of the closet in favor of marriage equality. Joe Biden out of the closet in favor of marriage equality defeated anti-marriage equality Republicans, Mitt Romney and the other guy. So Obama is not finished with us. The Obama administration then lends us critical support. Even before he came out in favor of marriage equality in 2011, Obama and his entire administration, mostly heterosexuals, had come out against DOMA as unconstitutional. And there you see Edie Windsor. Remember, she was proposed to in 1967. Her spouse died. But in 2013, she wins vindication for their lawful marriage and the end of DOMA. Justice Scalia, though in dissent in the case, said basically the reasoning that interred DOMA also ought to be fatal to those states which are still barring marriage equality. And as you see on the map that I've just displayed, federal judges all over the country agreed with them. Red, red, red. These are all the marriage equality states a year later, a little bit more than a year after Windsor, 2 years after the 2012 election triumphs. And notice some unusual states. Oklahoma, where did that come from? Federal court order. Utah, federal court order. Montana, federal court order. South Carolina, federal court order, with Republican as well as Democratic judges, following Justice Scalia's admonition that after Windsor, marriage equality was logically necessary. But we still needed a case. And 6 cases were brought in the Midwest in 4 different states: Michigan, Ohio, Tennessee, Kentucky. One of the Ohio cases was brought by Jim Obergefell and his late husband, John Arthur. Here they're on the airplane going to Maryland to get legally married. John Arthur literally on his deathbed. Those cases, 6 cases, 4 states, reached the Supreme Court in the very famous Obergefell versus Hodges, where Mary Bonato, remember her from the Goodridge case, does the oral argument. I was there. Her oral argument was magnificent. Don Verrilli, representing the Obama administration, magnificent. The justices, okay. And right after Verrilli had, or right before Verrilli spoke, right after Bonato sat down, 2 rows behind me, a gentleman rose and bellowed throughout the courtroom that God would judge the Supreme Court in America if it adopted homosexual marriages, which were an abomination. As you see, that's not my photo or my diagram. They don't allow that. But the marshals descended on him like birds on breadcrumbs. And he was dragged out into the hall where you could still hear his screaming as he was taken out of the building. Justice Scalia cracked, well, that was quite refreshing, wasn't it? Which was chilling to the dozens of LGBTQI people in the room, many of whom had been physically assaulted, fired, or otherwise harassed after similar verbalisms. Well, notwithstanding Scalia's crack, 5 justices voted in favor of nationwide marriage equality in Obergefell. Justice Kennedy, the Catholic Republican on the right, wrote the majority opinion, emphasizing a fundamental freedom to marry. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, an icon on the left, persuaded Justice Kennedy to add page after page of language also celebrating marriage equality. And so in many ways, Obergefell was an interesting wedding of the 2 different lines of words. Words matter. Freedom to marry, freedom of choice, but at the same time, marriage equality for our unions that had not existed before. Now, here's what's remarkable. What is remarkable is that in the period between Goodridge and Obergefell, that's about 12 years, there was a volte-face in American public opinion. Supreme Court never would have come out with this ruling as early as 2015 if there had not been such a major shift in public opinion. We'd not begun to win some of these initiatives and referendums. And so one of the themes that our book tackles is, how did this happen? And again, Black lives matter, women's lives matter, the lives of sexual and gender minorities matter. It was a collective effort. And here are the three things that factored into it. Thing number one, and that is that we all know sexual and gender minorities are a dispersed minority. We are literally everywhere. But we're invisible unless we come out of the closet. And millions of us came out of the closet in the 90s and the early part of the millennium. Many of us as committed couples, many of us couples raising children or single parents raising children. And the straight parents, siblings, neighbors, pastors, and whatnot were profoundly moved and altered by this. Many of the most conservative people in America, such as the Cheneys, their opinions changed immediately once they learned that their daughter Mary was not only a lesbian, but was a committed partner and now has produced grandchildren for the very conservative Cheneys. We called them the pop-up homosexuals. And the pop-up homosexuals recruited unexpected messengers all over America. And I think that made a big difference. Here's an example of one of those families whom we focus on in the book, April DeBoer and Jane Rouse, and 3 of their now 5 children. Second, when I worked on this in the 1990s, the boogeyman was, this was President Clinton's thing. Remember President Clinton, the big defender of marriage, that if you recognize committed lesbian couples raising children, this will wound and destroy the institution of marriage. Now, that was always a hysterical charge, but it was very hard to falsify until GLAAD and the other groups won in Massachusetts. So, did the sky fall? Did the locusts come? Was marriage destroyed? And in fact, the opposite occurred in Massachusetts. The marriage rate, which had been collapsing for more than a decade before Goodridge, actually had a huge rebound and then stabilized. Now, that doesn't prove that Goodridge was good, but it certainly does falsify the idea that Goodridge was bad for marriage. And everywhere all over America, people were asking themselves, am I hurt? Has my marriage been undermined? Was the Clinton marriage undermined by the lesbian couples? Were the Bush's marriage? We were told by the Bush administration that Laura was furious with her husband for endorsing the federal marriage amendment. The daughters were livid because they were ashamed that their family was supporting the opposition. A lot of straight people were on our side. And these are some of the general data for the United States. And then finally, and this is again where women come into play, at the same time that LGBTQI families are coming out of the closet, straight families are changing all over America, and what drives that change are the choices of women. Between 1967 and 2017, the American family changed in the direction of our families we choose. 2-income households, fewer children had later in life, more planned, many by ART, many by adoption, some by blended families and smaller families. And so one result of all of these pop-up lesbian and gay families was there was a more receptive audience to the idea, hey, these families and their aspirations are really not so different from mine. Now let me conclude with a couple of overall lessons. Even though we were successful, wow, we were only successful because a lot of things came together. It's very hard for a social movement to change entrenched attitudes and law. A lot has got to come together. A group awareness of injustice, the mobilization of a lot of its widely dispersed members, well-publicized ill treatment and refutation of stereotypes, the recruitment of unexpected messengers, political organization at the national and local level, a receptive political environment, and a great deal of luck. Remember, Anthony Kennedy took the seat reserved for Robert Bork. If Bork had gotten that seat, I don't think we would have won. And then there's some particular lessons you can see here, that it helps if your group are widely dispersed throughout the society and come out of the closet laser focused on this issue that's important to them. Moreover, it's easier to win liberty claims than equality claims, and easier still to win those claims over redistribution claims, which I think is very unfortunate. And then finally, if you win the landmark Supreme Court case, your work has only begun. You cannot rest on your laurels. Here are the Baker and McConnell family today. There's still a couple. I took that picture a few years ago, their original wedding rings. Here are Donna Burkett in the top, Paul Barwick, and Janora Dansel and her current partner and spouse today. And here is a picture I took of April DeBoer and Jane Rouse and their daughter Ryan. In other words, they always saw their marriage as not just the wedding of the two adults, but the wedding of all 7 of them, the children and the adults. I thank you for your attention.
Well, folks, we've got lots of time for questions if you have any. So put that into the Q&A. But Bill, I have to say, no one's ever called me a pop-up homosexual before. And it's one of those new things. I'm going to have to do something about that on Facebook, I think. But I've got some questions until we've got some questions from the audience. How do you think, you started out talking about how, that document from the government in the 40s and 50s that we were psychopaths and sick. How do you think that notion, those stereotypes, really undermined our ability to move forward for years and years and years?
Well, that's a very good point. And this is kind of a feminist point, is that when I was growing up, and I didn't realize it then, but this is what I think today, the central metaphor for sexual and gender minorities, which covers a broad field, starts with the idea they are sterile. It's all about conjugality. They are sterile. Because they are sterile, they are selfish and narcissistic. Because they are sterile and selfish, narcissistic, they are predatory. They want to take your children. Because they are sterile, selfish, and narcissistic and predatory, they're inherently anti-family. And that has been, it seems to me, a central sort of trope for anti-LGBTQI stereotyping. Now, there's also a lot of prejudice based upon sexuality and people's emotional instability. A lot of haters are themselves dealing with issues they have not resolved. But that central mode, and that was why I got involved in 1991, is I knew a lot of lesbian couples, my own sister and her partner, and I knew a lot of couples in DC. Some of them were raising children. And I knew that they were very similar, that they had love and commitment. They were pro-family. They were good families. And so that's one reason I was blindsided when so many liberals betrayed us, is that I thought, well, how can you do that? It's so unfactual. But the problem was it was very deeply ingrained in American society, not only prejudice against sexual minorities in particular, and gender minorities, but also these stereotypes, these recurring tropes. And that's one reason I do think I was always on the side we should push for marriage, is that I felt if we won marriage, that would help us on the other issues like jobs. And we've now seen it in Bostock. I think we won Bostock partly because of marriage. Those sex discrimination arguments were all being made, and we were winning oftentimes with them in the marriage cases. And that was where Anthony Kennedy first noticed, where John Roberts, a very conservative Republican, joined the opinion. Neil Gorsuch, very conservative Republican, wrote the opinion. And they both heard about the sex discrimination argument through the marriage cases.
Somebody, Kathleen is asking you to repeat the sterile, that whole thing. So if you could just repeat that again so people can take notes. And then I've got another question for you. But I do want to say one thing about the liberals who abandon us. I'm a political consultant. It's all about reelection. And in the 90s, in the 80s and the 90s, you know, no matter how liberal that you might have been or what party you were with, it was, and even now, it's always about being able to get reelected. And back then, the radical Christian right, as it does today, has a very potent voting base. And Bill Clinton would have lost his reelection. And we would have seen a major bloodbath in Congress for the Democrats if people had gone over, because the community, society wasn't there yet. The demographics hadn't changed yet. But what it did change is what I call the Will and Grace generation, the Bush's daughters. They grew up with that. They saw it on TV. It's normalized. They're just fun people. They knew their uncle or whoever it was, you know, the gay uncle that everybody has. And so it's about those demographic shifts and the relationship shifts of people coming out. That's why it's so important for people to come out, because if we stay in the closet, progress will never, ever happen. So if you can do the sterile trope thing, that would be great.
Yeah, I would also respond this though. We don't know, but yes, that's allegedly why Clinton didn't veto the Defense of Marriage Act. And that pretty much ensured his reelection. But Libby, he also ran campaign ads in the South touting his support for DOMA.
Sure, it makes sense.
So, but he did not need that to win re-election. He was being greedy and on the backs of gay people, and that was shameful. And this is at the very point he was having adulterous affairs, etc.
Well,
now, here's my little progression for the stereotype. So you start with the idea that sexual and gender minorities, in other words, non-different sex couples, are sterile. They can't have children inter se. That's step one. Then the link was made, because they're sterile, they're therefore narcissistic and selfish, because the model of self-giving is, you know, conjugality and having children. Because they're sterile, narcissistic, and selfish, they're also predatory. They want to take what's yours, take your job, your children, your marriage. They want to make you miserable. And then finally, because they're sterile, selfish, narcissistic, and predatory, they're by very definition anti-family. And I forgot to mention this, so I'll add this little plug. As we document in the book, when Bowers and Hardwick, the sodomy case, was being decided, Lewis Powell was originally the fifth vote to strike down consensual sodomy laws. He switched. And I have his notes, and I spoke to his law clerks for his very anguished soul searching, trying to decide what to vote. And the opinion that he originally drafted to concur, which he changed, started off with this line: homosexual sodomy is the antithesis of family.
Wow.
And because privacy, right to privacy, was all about family and relationships to him. Now, Blackmun didn't see it that way. He was in dissent. Justice White, who read the majority opinion, that's the way he saw it. And that ended up being the decisive reason. And here's the other irony, and that is that Lewis Powell discussed, you know, his soul searching with all of his law clerks. One of my students, Bill Stuntz, was a very conservative law clerk who was trying to persuade him to strike down the Georgia law. And a Yale student, a Yale alum, was one of his law clerks, and Powell said, and he said, well, he was the liberal, and Powell said, I just don't quite get the claims here. And Cabell-Chenis sort of explained what was going on. And Powell says, yeah, but I don't understand how these people can have relationships. And Cabell-Chenis said, well, yes, they do. They have boyfriends and girlfriends. The couples, some of them are raising children now. And Powell says, well, it just beats me. He says, you know, I've never met a homosexual. And of course, the law clerk he was talking to, Cabell-Chenis, had been openly gay at Yale but there was no occasion to be openly gay in the Powell chambers. Powell's secretary was a closeted lesbian. Between a quarter and a third of Powell's law clerks were closeted gay men and lesbians. Powell had more detectable gay men and lesbians, I think, than all the rest of the justices combined. Yet he had never met a homosexual. His biographer is gay. So how's that for irony?
Yeah,
What irony in the book?
that is pretty ironic. So a question that came in from Bill Jeffers: as heterosexual allies in a very tenuous political climate, how do we continue to support our LGBTQ friends and colleagues?
Well, I think that's a good question. And by the way, I'm going to turn that question around. I'm going to say, as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex people, queer people, how should we support our allies who need us? And I think part of the answer to that is just personal testimony. That if you hear anti-gay slurs, or just casual invocation of stereotypes, which you do hear, personally, I think the best response is not to admonish the speaker, or express outrage. So some people do that; it might be effective. I think the more effective thing is just to say, my best friend from college is gay, or my neighbor is lesbian raising children. And I really think she's just doing a spectacular job. And I just don't think any of this is true. I think, and correlatively, I'm openly gay. I teach at Yale. And I'm from the South. And I have a lot of relatives. Most of my relatives are still in the South. A lot of them voted for Trump. Okay. And I think it's very important that when more conservative people talk about Black Lives Matter or abortion choice, that LGBTQ people not remain silent. Again, you choose your own philosophy of how aggressive you should be. But I think you should say, well, we have a legacy of slavery. And a lot of the stuff we're seeing today, the Confederate monuments, the romanticization of slavery culture, the romanticization of people who would deny rights to people of color. None of this is new. This is the KKK era. And rather than calling this civil disturbance and chaos, we should call this an impulse to do better. And I do think we need allies, but I think we need to be allies.
I think it's sort of a right sizing of America, with everything that.
And I appreciate Bill Jeffers. There's a famous lawyer named Bill Jeffers. I don't know if it's the same one, but he's a major baron of the DC bar.
But I also think, heterosexual folks, we appreciate and I think it's incredibly important for straight people to stand up for LGBTQ folks, because not everybody will. And when a straight person does, another straight person does, another straight person does, and it just builds a base of support, as you saw in the graph about how opposing marriage equality went down and supporting it went up. And I go back to the 80s and 90s and AIDS, and how while AIDS was a horrible scourge on our community, and we lost people like Tom Stoddard, who was pictured in one of the slides, it normalized, in a sense, the relationships between people with AIDS and their families. Almost everybody knew somebody who was impacted by AIDS, who lost somebody, who saw somebody go through this whole thing and have to suffer the way folks did. And so I think that too, sort of paved the way for all the other accomplishments that we've had, but on the backs and on the coffins of so many gay men and some lesbians, and now people of color who have died because of it and drug users. But in the 90s, you know, it was the gay men who were dying in legions, you know, and it just has really helped to set the stage in a sense of moving our movement forward because of the relationships that people had. You know, the Southern mom, right, whose son was gay and he was afraid to come out, finally tells her he's sick. She takes him in and takes care of him, and it changes her life forever. And it makes her speak out, which is what's important. Hannah Chronic asks, what do you think the chances of Bostock remaining the ruling law are given RFRA, which I'm not sure what that means.
Religious Freedom Reformation Act, Restoration.
Okay. And Gorsuch's opinion mentioning bathrooms, locker rooms, etc., being up for future debate, and also considering Fulton v. Philadelphia.
Okay, so well, Bostock survived. So Bostock is the decision a few months ago, 6-3. So 2 conservative Republicans, 4 more liberal Democrats, said that Title VII, which bars discrimination, workplace discrimination because of an individual's sex, includes sex and gender minorities. Duh, but they hold that. Now, I think that's going to be robust. You know, look, President Trump said that seems fine with him. Big business, fine with it. Now, the dollop at the end is that, so that discrimination is now in Title VII, and I don't see it being overruled. But here's the catch that your questioner is referring to. Gorsuch refers to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act and possible religious employers. The question becomes, we already know from the Supreme Court that if you are a church or a religious organization, your ministers, they've already said you can involve yourself in race discrimination, sex discrimination, disability, etc. And the religion clauses protect you against lawsuits under Title VII. That's already the holding. And so for religious organizations, people they consider ministers will not be covered by this. The question becomes, what about companies, closely held companies that are controlled by religious people, like the Hobby Lobby case, which was an interpretation of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And there, it does seem like it's quite possible that the 5 Republicans will extend RFRA to protect some private employers, maybe partnerships, maybe closely held corporations, etc. Now, it remains to be seen, you know, how many of these employers there are going to be. It really does, but there will be some. The caller also referred to the Fulton case, which the Supreme Court is going to hear this coming term. It's slightly different because it involved Philadelphia's foster care government program. They said, well, Catholic Services, whom we're paying you to be part of a government program, we cannot have discrimination against lesbian and gay couples, and so we're not going to pay you and include you anymore. That's a somewhat different set of issues, and we'll see what the Supreme Court does with them. But the ministerial exception, we'll see how broad that becomes, and then we'll see not whether, but how the conservative majority applies RFRA to Title VII. So there will be some allowances probably.
Do you think the RFRA will also have an impact on reproductive rights and, you know, employers discriminating, not just about birth control, but, you know, when we talk about reproductive rights, it's a lesbian and gay issue because we want to have kids. And so lesbians can become pregnant and gay men can do the surrogacy route or do the adoption route. But, you know, I see this as a real threat to undermining what we've been able to accomplish.
Yeah, and the big case is the Hobby Lobby case, and then the Little Sisters case this term upheld Trump administration regulations that really cut back on requirements for contraceptive coverage. So that's the battle. That's a lot of the battle going forward. And as your listeners also should be aware, the Trump administration, right before Bostock, had interpreted the Affordable Care Act, which prohibits discrimination because of sex and provision of health care. The Obama administration had interpreted that to include sex and gender minorities. Trump administration simply repealed that. At the same time, the Supreme Court said, no, discrimination because of sex means sex and gender minorities, not just men and women. And so we'll see where that goes.
So another question came in from Paula Zimmerman. How much damage is Trump able to do to the LGBTQ plus community's rights over the next few months, and then possibly, parenthetically, hopefully not, over the next 4 years?
Well, several things. Number one, Obergefell, to some extent, is in play in this election. If we have 2 more judicial appointments in the next 4 years, that could produce a Supreme Court majority either willing to overrule Obergefell or more likely to chip away at it. Also, that's guaranteed to support a Supreme Court majority that will interpret RFRA super broadly, the ministerial exception super broadly. And there are many conservative organizations, like Focus on the Family is now a church. And so it probably has oodles of ministers for whom they're going to be claiming exemption from Title VII. So in appointing federal judges, the Trump administration, though Neil Gorsuch, one of the appointees, wrote the majority opinion in Bostock. But the Trump administration is generally appointing federal judges who are going to be hostile to Obergefell in some way or another. I think though, Obergefell, our book, hopefully will help contribute to the case that Obergefell survives. I think Bostock will survive. I think the main damage that the Trump administration will do will be to LGBTQI plus people who are disadvantaged, people with working class jobs, people without jobs and often with health insurance, people who are ill with AIDS or other debilitating illnesses, now of course including COVID. COVID is way disproportionately affecting disadvantaged communities, economically and health-wise disadvantaged communities. And that's us. That's us as well as people of color and women and workers. And that is deeply immoral. That is deeply immoral for the government not to stand up and lend a helping hand rather than a boot in the face to people who are disadvantaged. So yeah, I think there's a lot on the line.
You talked a little bit about the federal courts, and when you were speaking before, I made a note, when you talk about the federal courts and all these appointments, it's obvious why the GOP is targeting these seats, is because they do want to rewrite the law. They do want to turn back time when it comes to our rights, when it comes to women's rights, when it comes to Voting Act, when it comes to all the things that we hold dear. People don't recognize. I mean, I remember when John Kerry was running for president, I was saying, it's the Supreme Court. It's the Supreme Court. I mean, that was 2004, and it's the same litany. It's the courts. And we used to be able to say, okay, the legislature's not going to find their backbone, so we'll go to the courts. And the courts usually did the right thing. And now the courts are being stacked so that they don't do the right thing. And now we got to go back to the legislature hoping that they do the right thing. It's really, an imbalanced situation for anybody who's not white, male, and basically rich.
Well, here's another thing I would say to that, though. And that is that in the recent past, and maybe before that as well, Republican voters tend to be more motivated by the court issue than the Democratic voters do. And we saw that in the Clinton election. Like, what else explains, for the book, we interviewed a lot of people throughout the country, but particularly in the Midwest, who were pro-life, who were critical of same-sex marriage from a feminist point of view, and so on. We had dinner, we met with people, we telephoned with people, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of these folks, most of these folks were Trump supporters. And so I would ask them at dinner, pro-life female activists, and I would say, well, what's your number one reason for supporting President Trump? And they would say, Roe versus Wade. I said, okay, well, what's your number two reason? Casey versus Planned Parenthood. Mm-hmm. I would say, well, what's your number three reason? Abortion choice. They knew all the cases. They knew the cases better than the lawyers did. They knew the cases. These were women who were not lawyers. And they were out canvassing. And then the Obergefell would be somewhere on the list. It'd be like reason number 4 or 5. But it was overwhelmingly abortion choice.
Absolutely.
And so what the Republicans are going to do, this is of course their strategy, milk the issue that you campaign on. We're the only ones who can overrule Roe versus Wade, but it's always going to be just one appointment away, right? Because the last thing they want is for Roe versus Wade to be actually overruled, and certainly not in an election year, right? Because then, we don't need to vote for Trump anymore, and a lot of people will be very upset if Roe versus Wade is overruled. So that's the way that plays out, I'm afraid. And it's, we have a whole chapter on religion, and I myself am religious, and we spoke to a lot of religious folks on all sides of the issue. So again, it's not just Black Lives Matter, women's lives matter, religious lives matter, including people who disagree with us. I love those people. They were great sources for my book. They were inspirational for me. I really loved the people who were against me, and I felt that they spoke very frankly to me. And I've told them, I've told ministers this, I've told lay people this. I said, here is a great tragedy, I think, facing American religion, particularly Judaism and Christianity, but particularly fundamentalist conservative Christianity, is that Christianity is named after Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. And I think no one who's occupied the Oval Office better reflects the antithesis of everything that Jesus Christ stood for, everything that Jesus Christ said, everything the Christian religion is supposed to be about than the current incumbent. And yet Christian leaders still are falling over themselves to support this re-election. And I pled with them. I said, young people, religion, Christianity has got to stand for positive things. You cannot, I think it's turning your back on Christ, but it's also turning your back on the next generation if you do not appeal to what is genuinely good and positive. Okay, and I made a lot of blunders when I would make these arguments, because they would ask me what are some positive things. And I remember with one congregation, I said, well, climate. I thought, young people are very interested in that, and I see we're the Bible teaches me that we're stewards of the earth, and we're not performing our stewardship in a very responsible way. Well, the minister's wife told me, and I was like, oh my goodness, this was a blunder. She said, well, in our faith, professor, we believe that God is in control of all of that, and we're not responsible for climate change. I thought, whoops,
yep.
Apologize to them.
Yeah.
So I made a lot of mistakes in that pitch, but I was heartfelt in the pitch that Christianity itself is at stake. And it can all vanish overnight if young people en masse turn away from faith traditions that are negative and hateful and supporting lost causes.
And we're seeing that happen. We are seeing that happen.
And I'll admit it. I'm very sorry about that.
Yeah. And you talk about the faith leaders, what I call the radical Christian right, embracing Trump, and it comes down to a number of things. One, they hate the same people that he hates. That's number one, and that's where his followers are too. I've said all along, this is all about race. But also the faith leaders, the radical Christian right, they want to undo abortion rights in this country, and they want gay people, LGBTQ, all of us to go live on an island somewhere so that they don't have to deal with us. And they would rather that we just disappear. And so it's always been about policy and the courts for these folks. And that's, their driving reason for staying behind Trump, regardless of how unchristian this man is, how much he lies, how much he undermines democracy. They're not worried about democracy. They're worried about the policies that they're worried about, and they're worried about making sure that their churches, unfortunately, remain white. So we have a question from an anonymous attendee. I frequently get the impression that some folk think that, quote, being conservative is a monolith of belief, meaning that being conservative on topic A means that the person in question does not support marriage equality or LGBTQ plus rights in general. How do we develop our dialogue in a way that does not support that assumption? You need me to repeat that?
Well, yeah, I mean, our whole book is about the heterogeneity of support for marriage equality. And I might also add the heterogeneity of opposition. So when we were entering the home stretch, this period from during the Obama administration, basically, key support for marriage equality, came from the Bushes, from the Cheneys. In terms of judges, Anthony Kennedy is a conservative. He's out of the closet. There's no secret that he's a conservative. And he wrote all the major opinions. When DOMA was being challenged, the Defense of Marriage Act, who wrote the opinions assassinating DOMA before it got to the Supreme Court? Well, Alex Kozinski, right-wing judge in the Ninth Circuit. Michael Boudin, a Bush appointee in the First Circuit. Dennis Jacobs, a Bush appointee in New York, who wrote the Edie Windsor opinion. Right? Joseph Toro, who was a Nixon appointee, called them crusty, old, Nixonian, Republican, conservative. Joseph Toro wrote the first big opinion striking down DOMA in a Mary Bonato case. So, yeah, and a lot of conservative Christians ended up supporting marriage equality. Many conservative Christians were against marriage equality. There's a debate within most of the major religions on these issues. Pope Francis is a theologically conservative Catholic in most ways, but he's very inclusive. And I think he might be the first pope to use language like LGBTQ and gay in official documents. Religion is changing. And yes, and I think, now, here's another angle. First book I ever published on this was called The Case for Same-Sex Marriage. And the book was attacked from the right, that these people are not marriage worthy, that kind of thing. But also I got a lot of questions from the left, that this was too conservative. This is, Paula didn't attack the book for that reason, but a lot of progressives very legitimately said, well, this is too conservative. Marriage is a conservative institution. To much my feminist response was that marriage is an evolving institution. And once we have lesbians raising children, that's going to change the nature of marriage. And I think it has, but in a good way, okay? So there are a lot of conservative things. The military, a lot of LGBTQI people are in the military. That's a pretty conservative institution. But I'm glad there are queer people in the military. So I do think that the conservative liberal divide, the liberals have betrayed us frequently enough. Conservatives sometimes come to our rescue when you don't expect it. And the world is unpredictable. But again, these ideas, the pop-up homosexuals. One of the most conservative judges in America is a man named Jerry Holmes. He's 10th Circuit, which is the very big deal. Court of Appeals includes Oklahoma, where he's from. He was nominated by probably the two most anti-gay senators in American history, a very competitive category, Coburn and Inhofe. Republicans, he's a Republican. And he voted for marriage equality. He was the decisive vote striking down the Utah exclusion and then the Oklahoma exclusion. These are in 2014. Big surprise. And so I called him up, I emailed him. He was a very lovely man, not very forthcoming. And so I thought, well, maybe it's because he was the first African American to be a judge on the 10th Circuit. Very big deal. I thought, well, I wonder if he's involved in an interracial marriage. And I discovered that he was dating a white woman, a wonderful woman named Jerry Towler, whom he later married. I thought, well, maybe that has something to do with it. So I contacted her daughter, because I discovered that she had this consulting firm that did gay pride in Oklahoma. And her daughter, Alex, so I emailed both her and her daughter. Her daughter responded to me and said, oh, yes, blah, 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 blah. Yes, oh, yes, stepfather is very supportive, blah, 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 blah. And then it turns out that Alex, right after Oklahoma was forced to recognize gay marriage by decree, Alex married another woman. Okay, so what influenced this extremely conservative judge? Was it pop-up homosexuals? Not sure. Was it the Loving analogy? Not sure. Was it the rule of law? This guy, Judge Holmes, very conservative, but Supreme Court precedent supported what he said. The Supreme Court had said that prisoners have a fundamental right to marry. Deadbeat dads have a fundamental right. So if convicted criminals and deadbeat dads who are not credits to their sexual orientation have a fundamental right to marry, why not committed lesbian couples raising children, I say. And Judge Holmes ultimately agreed. All I can say is that I think the context of his horizon surely was influenced by the fact that he was part of a broader culture in Oklahoma. He had a different perspective as a man of color who was very committed to a white woman. And he had a stepdaughter whom he adored, who was a lesbian and who later did get married. So it's very complicated. You can't always predict. And it's not driven just by liberal versus conservative. It's a lot driven by with whom do we have empathy? And if I could editorialize just a little bit here, I do believe that's the greatest failing of American politics. It's gotten worse in the last 4 years. The lack of empathy, the lack of genuine interest in everybody. I think that was a problem for the Democrats in 2016. Snarky comments about people they felt were disposable. And on the other side, snarky comments about people they thought were disposable. And I think that's very lamentable. And I think the way to deal with that is not simply to denounce it or to make fun of it, but to insist upon trying to understand different points of view, and doing so from a perspective of sympathy and empathy. And that's, by the way, the project of our book. We're two gay men who write a lot of the book from the perspective we think of feminism, straight women, gay, bisexual women. The heroes of our book are not people like us. It's a huge array of people of all sorts. We're the only book, even to mention, we give it a lot of emphasis, the first federal lawsuit was by a Black lesbian couple. Whoever has even mentioned that? No one. The first state lawsuit was one of the plaintiffs was a transgender person. And this recurs throughout the book, where the forgotten participants are given some emphasis. And that's our goal. And we hope that that makes it like a better read, because you're meeting wonderful people and a variety of them, including conservatives.
So we don't have any more questions yet. And we have 15, 17 minutes left. So if you want to ask a question, get it in now. But I just want to go back to Paula Edelbrecht, who both of us knew her. And I thought she was a wonderful lawyer and a great advocate for the community. And she was at the Pride Agenda. I was the founder of the Pride Agenda. And I know that she was a feminist at heart, and her view of marriage came from her feminist perspective, which I get. I'm married, but right now it's important for us to marry if we have children because of all the legal stuff and all the financial implications. But she said it was a poor strategic choice. Marriage will crowd out job protection, sodomy reform, hate crimes, which should be our top priority. So I'm wondering, now that, marriage did take center stage, and I don't think we were really prepared for it. We certainly weren't prepared for it when Jason West and Gavin Newsom started doing marriages in San Francisco and New Paltz. I wonder what you think has now, how that all has now defined where the gay community, where the LGBTQ community is going, what the issues are going to be. I mean, I remember hearing from trans folks that marriage totally destroyed their ability to move forward because everybody put the money into marriage. And I can say with a good degree of certainty that the Pride agenda closed its doors because the A-list party boys in New York City wanted to fund marriage, but they weren't willing to fund transgender issues and transgender rights. So where do we go from here?
Well, here's a big point made in the concluding chapters of the book. And this point derives from race theory, the very famous Professor Derek Bell, that the tendency of many social movements, and we were no exception, is that the social movement's victories disproportionately benefited people in our minority who were already most like the mainstream. Very often entitled, well-to-do, well-educated, very often white, very often male, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's been true of marriage, because at the same time we're winning marriage equality, marriage itself has bifurcated, and we document this in the last chapter. Marriage itself has bifurcated, that among well-to-do, highly educated Americans, marriage is still pretty robust. And if you're divorced, you tend to get married again. But among Americans who are working class, unemployed, poor, welfare, marginalized, marriage has steadily nosedived. And so the advantages of marriage equality have been disproportionately, obviously, that first group of LGBT people. Now, I do think it's helped all sexual and gender minorities, because the marriage equality movement was absolutely critical in winning sodomy reform in Lawrence versus Texas. Absolutely critical. We tell that story in the book. It's been very important in job discrimination now with Bostock, which is not in the book because it just was handed down. And that does help everybody. But again, with Bostock, you got to have a job. And you got to have a job in a company with more than a certain number of employees. And that's not all lesbian and gay people, right? So, yeah, I think it has had that effect. And Paula did prophesy that. And that was, and that is a cost of focusing on marriage equality. On the other hand, those rich gay billionaires, if we never had marriage equality on the agenda, they wouldn't have contributed money to start with. Most of them, probably.
Except that, it's what's interesting is that the people who rushed to get married after marriage equality was, in New York in 2011 and then nationally, were the lesbians. I know many, many more lesbian couples who have gotten married than gay male couples who have gotten married. But it was the gay men who foot the bill, which we appreciate, that's for sure. But it's just very interesting that, they wanted to do that. And it has left the transgender community, I think, under the 8 ball, behind the 8 ball, because the finances aren't there, because the fiscal response, what would have felt about fiscal responsibility to our organizations is not necessarily there. And
on the other hand, though, Libby, there are some ways in which this helped advance the ball. Because remember, Bostock, one of the plaintiffs is M.A. Stevens.
Right.
Bostock lifted all boats. It's transgender persons as well as lesbians and gay men. And moreover, the recent victory we had in Massachusetts on the referendum for the anti-discrimination gender identity legislation. Remember, we lose a lot of those initiatives, even in urban areas and even in liberal jurisdictions. And we romped in the Massachusetts one. And the task force and others that were masterminding our campaign there, we were able to raise a lot of money. but the messaging in these pro-trans, anti-initiative campaigns was molded by the experts who learned tons. We have a whole chapter on this, what we learned about messaging in the period from 2009 to 2012. And a lot of that has been carried over. And because look, if you cannot protect your progressive victories against initiative campaigns to revoke them, you're going to be impeded in how much progress you can make. So it has had, I'd say, at least at the very best, mixed effects.
Well, I think from an organizational point of view, a growing up point of view for the community, marriage equality has given us a professionalization in a sense, but also the notion of paying attention to messaging, which people didn't necessarily get before, is really important. You know, I do it for a living, and it is incredibly important. And, you know, the notion of marriage equality set the stage for us to be able to move forward, because if we continue to call it gay marriage, it wasn't going to go. But marriage equality is a different message, and it's a message of equality and leveling the playing field. So my last question, and I think we're going to wrap up soon because we don't have any more questions from the audience, is, and you talked about this a little bit, can you expound a little bit about the liberty versus equality arguments? Because I find that fascinating, and I don't think everybody can really gets it.
Good, excellent point, Libby. Well, in the chapter we do on the 2012 initiatives, it was a little bit of a showdown within our movement. That Human Rights Campaign had used the term marriage equality for quite a while. It originated about 1999. Freedom to marry, as the name suggests, said freedom to marry. And in the states, particularly Maine and Minnesota, where they controlled the messaging, they insisted you do not say marriage equality, you say freedom to marry. And that was based on data. Delia Zapatos, who's the kind of star of that chapter, had done all this research. And she found that equality language was a turnoff to some voters. And remember, you're usually battling for just this very narrow band of voters that are the undecided or the conflicted voters, not a very big portion of the electorate. And freedom to marry found through polling that those voters were more persuaded by a freedom, more Republican, more libertarian, keep the government off our backs, but make them give us marriage licenses. Okay? Now, in Maryland, for example, HRC was more important. And in Maryland, they tended to use the marriage equality language. In Washington, they used both, which is our tendency in the book. We respect both. And we think both show up in Obergefell. So we like this synthesis. And here's the irony, is that we won all four of them by almost exactly the same margins. You know, however much money we spent, however badly the other side ran its campaign, whatever the rhetoric was, we won exactly the same. It was like 52, 53% of the vote, which is pretty good for us in each of those states. So words matter. Joe, we go back to his theme, words do matter. They might not matter quite as much as some in the gayocracy think they do.
Okay, well, Bill, I want to thank you for a great, oh, wait, I think we might have another question. I have no questions, okay, but I personally and deeply thank you for the work you've done throughout our lives. So, wow, blown away, so insightful, informative, hopeful, engaging. Thank you both very much. My questions were spot on. Well, thank you very much. And they're going to go out and buy the book. So there you go. And just so people know, it's like 900 pages. So be prepared.
No.
Well, the proof that I got was 900 pages.
You don't have to read the footnotes in the index. It's a rather svelte 700 pages if you just read the story.
Okay, fine. 700 pages. It's
There's
like reading
pictures.
reading
facts. It's
John Adams, you know, those
it's
kinds
like
of
a vacation.
Right.
It's great beach reading if you're able to get to a beach.
Right. So, Bill, I just want to say thank you again. This has been great. I'm going to turn this back over to Joe. Todd, thank you, and Elizabeth, and everybody else from SUNY for making this happen. Joe?
Thank you, Libby.
What a privilege to have this session. We are all very excited about the book. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Libby. And thank you for all of the work that both of you have done over the course of a career. Thank you to Dr. Todd Laursen, who convened this very, very important session. We have about a half an hour for you to grab some food, grab a drink, check your email, and join us back here for Making Your Title IX Practices More Inclusive, the intersection of Title IX and LGBTQ+ support. We have incredible speakers from SUNY New Paltz and from SUNY Alfred State, Nikki Herman and Emma Marcone, and that's going to be an incredible session. And then join us back tomorrow. We start in the mid-morning on the East Coast, early morning on the West Coast, and we will close with the 9-on-9 session, where we are going to talk about a number of the legal cases that I know Bill is thinking about, and we look forward to that. So best wishes to everyone. We are grateful to you for joining us, and we will see you back a little later in the evening. Take care, everyone. That'll end the session.
Thank you.
Thank you.